They have no bodies, no names, no inscriptions to tell us who they were. Just 17 enormous stone faces, buried in the jungle of Mexico for 3,000 years, each one weighing more than a city bus, each one carved from a single piece of volcanic rock by people who had no wheels, no metal tools, and no animals strong enough to pull a cart. And for almost 200 years, the people who studied these faces got the most basic question about them wrong. Not because the evidence wasn't there. It was there the whole time, buried right next to the stones. It just took modern science, archaeology, chemistry, genetics, and now pattern recognition tools powerful enough to hold thousands of data points in view at once, to finally put all the pieces on the same table. What that combined picture shows is not a mystery about who made these heads. It's a story about why we spent 2 centuries refusing to believe the obvious answer. Let's start with what's actually sitting in that jungle. In the lowlands along Mexico's Gulf Coast, in the modern states of Veracruz and Tabasco, archaeologists have recovered 17 colossal stone heads. The smallest stands about 5 feet tall. The largest is over 11 feet and weighs close to 50 tons, roughly the weight of 8 adult elephants, carved out of a single block of basalt. There are no seams, no joints, no smaller pieces fitted together. Someone selected one massive boulder, and out of that one boulder, they carved a face. And the faces are not identical. Look at 2 of them side by side, and you immediately see it. Different brow lines, different noses, different mouths, different headdresses. One face looks weathered and stern, like it belongs to someone who carried real weight on his shoulders. Another looks younger, softer around the eyes. These were never meant to be generic symbols. They were meant to be someone. To understand why that matters, you have to understand who carved them. Long before the Maya built their pyramids, long before the Aztecs ruled a lake-bound empire, there was a civilization on the Gulf Coast that modern scholars call the Olmec. That's not what they called themselves. We don't actually know that name. Olmec comes from a much later Nahuatl word meaning roughly rubber people, used by the Aztecs to describe the inhabitants of that region long after the original civilization had collapsed. But between roughly 1500 and 400 BC, this culture built the first real cities in Mesoamerica. San Lorenzo rose first, around 1200 BC, with planned mounds, drainage systems, and monumental sculpture. La Venta followed, home to a massive earthen pyramid and elaborate ceremonial offerings buried deep in the ground. Tres Zapotes carried the tradition forward after the others declined. These weren't scattered farming villages. They were organized political and religious centers, capable of directing enormous amounts of labor toward public works. And what they left behind didn't just influence the region, it became the template for everything that followed. The Maya calendar system has roots that trace back to Olmec conventions. Central deities and religious imagery that show up again and again across 1,000 years of Mesoamerican art. Jaguar-human hybrids, rain gods, maize gods, first appear in Olmec form. Even the idea of writing itself may trace back to them. A stone slab called the Cascadel block, discovered in Veracruz and dated to around 900 BC, is carved with rows of repeating symbols arranged in what looks like a deliberate sequence. Many specialists consider it the earliest known writing system in the Americas, though it remains a genuinely debated find, since so few examples of the script have turned up. If the reading holds, it means writing was invented independently on this side of the world, the same way it was in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and China, with zero contact between any of them. That's an almost unbelievable achievement for a civilization most people have never heard of. So this was not a minor culture. This was, by any reasonable definition, the foundation that Mesoamerican civilization was built on. Which makes it especially strange that for 2 centuries, people looked at the most famous objects the civilization left behind, these 17 giant carved faces, and decided they couldn't possibly be a product of the people who made them. That story starts in 1862, in the state of Veracruz, when a farm worker clearing land struck something solid buried in the earth. He assumed it was the base of an enormous overturned pot. He kept digging. It wasn't a pot. It was a face, a colossal stone head with heavy-lidded eyes, full lips, and a tight-fitting helmet-like headdress. It was the first Olmec head the modern world had ever seen, and word of the discovery reached a Mexican antiquarian named José María Melgar y Serrano. When he examined the sculpture, he didn't describe what was actually in front of him. He described what his own assumptions told him should be there. He declared the features Ethiopian and concluded the head must depict a person of African origin, carved by influence that had somehow crossed the Atlantic Ocean into ancient Mexico. It's worth sitting with how thin that claim actually was. Melgar y Serrano had no artifact linking the Gulf Coast to Africa. No trade goods, no shared technology, no linguistic connection, nothing. What he had was a deeply held colonial-era assumption that indigenous peoples of the Americas were not capable of producing sophisticated monumental art on their own, and that anything this impressive had to have come from somewhere else. He wasn't reading the stone. He was reading his own worldview back out of it. Normally, an idea built on that little evidence fades once real archaeology arrives. This one didn't. It slipped out of scholarly circles and into popular imagination, and it kept getting repeated for decades, largely because it was emotionally useful to different people for different reasons, not because any new evidence supported it. The real turning point came in the 1930s, when American archaeologist Matthew Stirling led a series of expeditions to the Gulf Coast on behalf of the Smithsonian Institution and National Geographic. Stirling's teams didn't set out to solve a myth. They set out to do basic, unglamorous archaeological work, excavate the sites, document what they found, and build a chronology. They uncovered more colossal heads, along with altars, thrones, and jade offerings, and through careful stratigraphic work they were able to date the Olmec culture with real precision. What they found upended assumptions in the opposite direction from what people expected. The Olmec weren't a late, derivative culture borrowing ideas from elsewhere. They were earlier than the Maya, earlier than almost anyone had assumed possible for such sophisticated monumental construction in the Americas. They sat at the very root of Mesoamerican civilization, not somewhere downstream of it. Nowhere in Stirling's work, or in the decades of professional archaeology that followed, did anyone find evidence supporting a transatlantic African origin for the heads. Not because nobody looked, because it simply wasn't there. What emerged instead, layer by layer, was a civilization that explained itself entirely on its own terms, without needing outside visitors to account for anything it built. Once archaeologists accepted that these were genuine portraits rather than symbolic types, the entire question around the heads changed shape. It stopped being why do these faces look unusual, and became who were these specific, powerful individuals? Because you don't move 50 tons of stone to honor a stranger, or to depict a generic ancestor type. You do it to permanently record the face of someone who held real authority, a ruler, a king, someone whose identity mattered enough that an entire community organized itself around preserving his likeness in the hardest material available. That is now the leading interpretation among archaeologists. The colossal heads depict Olmec rulers, individually commissioned, individually carved, meant to endure. And here is where more recent lines of evidence come in, not to overturn that conclusion, but to reinforce it from completely different angles. Human facial features don't sort into the neat racial categories that 19th century European scholars imagined. Broad noses and full lips are common and entirely natural across indigenous American populations, and always have been. Treating those features as evidence of a specific foreign origin was based on a flawed framework for how human variation actually works, not on anything the sculptures themselves demonstrate. Modern population genetics has also mapped the ancestry of indigenous peoples of the Americas in detail, tracing lineages back to groups who crossed from Asia via the Bering Land Bridge many thousands of years before the Olmec civilization existed. Across the large genetic datasets researchers have studied, there is no African genetic signature detected in pre-Columbian indigenous American populations. If there had been sustained contact and intermixing during the Olmec period, you would expect it to show up somewhere in that record. It doesn't. Skeletal chemistry adds another independent thread. Researchers have used strontium isotope analysis on human remains recovered from Olmec period sites. Strontium enters the body through food and water, and its isotopic ratio varies depending on local geology, becoming locked into tooth enamel during childhood, effectively a chemical record of where a person grew up. Isotope studies on Olmec region remains are consistent with populations that were locally raised, not long-distance travelers arriving from another continent. Put those threads together, the archaeological chronology, the anthropological understanding of facial variation, the isotope chemistry, and the genetic record, and you get several independent scientific approaches, developed decades apart using completely different methods, all converging on the same basic conclusion: the people who built San Lorenzo and La Venta, and the rulers whose faces are carved into these stones, were the indigenous inhabitants of that landscape. Not visitors. Not the product of contact with a distant continent. Homegrown from the ground up. You'd think that kind of convergence would have permanently closed the question. It didn't. In the 1970s, the African origin idea returned in a very different form. A researcher named Ivan van Sertima published a widely read book arguing that Africans had reached and influenced the Americas well before Columbus, and he pointed to the Olmec heads as central evidence for that claim. This version of the theory carried a very different emotional charge than Melgar y Serrano's had. It wasn't rooted in colonial contempt for indigenous achievement. For many who embraced it, it was an act of reclamation, a way of writing African peoples back into a global historical narrative that had spent centuries minimizing or erasing their contributions. That motivation is genuinely understandable. It comes out of a real and painful history of erasure. But a sympathetic motivation doesn't make a factual claim true, and when historians and archaeologists went back through Van Sertima's argument line by line, checking his sources and his citations, the case did not hold up. Scholars who reviewed the work found that it relied on selective quotation, on evidence taken out of its original context, and on conclusions that the underlying data simply didn't support. The facial features were once again being read through the same flawed 19th century racial framework, just aimed at a different, more sympathetic outside origin instead of a hostile one. The archaeological, isotopic, and genetic evidence that ruled out transatlantic contact in 1930 still ruled it out in 1976, and it still rules it out today. And that's where the real irony of this whole 200-year story sits. Melgar y Serrano, in 1862, couldn't accept that indigenous Mexicans had built something this sophisticated on their own, so he handed the credit to Africa. A century later, a very different argument, built from a completely opposite motivation, arrived at the exact same structural conclusion, that the people living on that land could not have built what stands on that land, so the achievement had to be traced back across an ocean. Two arguments, one born from contempt and one from a desire to restore dignity to an erased history, ended up making the identical move, taking the accomplishment out of Olmec hands. Both without meaning to erase the very civilization they claimed to be explaining. There's another layer to this that rarely gets the attention it deserves, just how far Olmec influence actually traveled after the civilization itself declined. Researchers tracing the visual language of Mesoamerican art have documented that certain motifs first appearing in Olmec sculpture and pottery, a snarling supernatural figure with a cleft head, early forms of rain and maize deities, the word jaguar imagery blending human and animal features, kept resurfacing in the art of cultures that rose centuries after the Olmec centers were abandoned. A symbol carved on the Gulf Coast before 1000 BC was still showing up on temple walls 1,000 years later, created by people who had never heard the name we now use for its originators and had no idea where the imagery had come from. That's not a small cultural footprint. That's the kind of influence you'd normally associate with a civilization that stayed powerful and visible for its entire history, not one that had already collapsed and been swallowed by forest regrowth centuries earlier. Which brings us to what actually deserves the attention here, because the real story isn't who these faces resemble. It's what the people who carved them managed to pull off with nothing but muscle, rope, timber, and organization. All 17 heads were carved from basalt quarried in the Tuxtla Mountains, a volcanic range roughly 60 miles from where most of the heads were ultimately placed. 60 miles of dense rainforest, river crossings, and swampland that turns to knee-deep mud in the wet season. The Olmec had no wheeled vehicles. No horses, no oxen, no domesticated animal in the Americas at that time was strong enough to haul a load like that anyway. No iron or bronze tools. The leading reconstruction of how they moved 50-ton boulders that distance involves floating blocks on rafts down rivers wherever the water allowed, and dragging them overland on wooden rollers, hauled inch by ropes pulled by hundreds of coordinated laborers. Try to actually picture that. The mud, the humidity, the sheer sustained coordination it takes to move something that heavy even a single body length at a time, and then to repeat that effort for dozens of miles, more than once for stone after stone. That's not just a transportation puzzle. That's a portrait of a functioning state, a society capable of organizing, feeding, and directing the labor of enough people over enough time to accomplish something that would be genuinely difficult with modern heavy equipment, let alone stone tools. That is the actual mystery worth marveling at. Not where the faces came from, but how a civilization with none of the technology we usually assume is required for monumental construction managed to build cities, invent writing independently, lay the groundwork for the calendar systems and religious cosmology that would shape an entire hemisphere for the next 2,000 years, and immortalize its rulers in stone heavy enough to outlast empires. We still don't know most of their rulers' names. The script that might identify them hasn't been fully deciphered, and may never be. But we know this much with real confidence. These 17 faces are not symbols, and they're not evidence of some outside civilization reaching across an ocean. They are portraits, individual, deliberate, permanent portraits of real people who held real power on the Gulf Coast of Mexico 3,000 years ago, made by their own people for their own reasons, using their own ingenuity. The shock isn't that new analysis changed the answer. It's that the answer was sitting there in the dirt for 100 years, confirmed independently by archaeology, chemistry, and genetics, while the popular story kept looking everywhere except at the people who actually did the work. So here's the question worth asking. For 2 centuries, observers looked at one of the most accomplished civilizations of the ancient world and, for very different reasons, couldn't let it take credit for its own achievement. First out of prejudice, later out of a desire to correct a different injustice, but both times reaching outward instead of simply accepting what the evidence already showed. Why is it so hard, even now, to just believe that a people built something extraordinary entirely on their own? Let me know what you think in the comments, and tell me which lost civilization you want covered next.